At 62, the life of Randy Johnson, the towering, intimidating legend known as the Big Unit, looks nothing like the highlight reels that once defined him. For decades, fans saw a superhuman figure on the mound, a man who shattered records, terrified batters, and carved his name into history as one of the most dominant pitchers ever to play the game. But behind the fire, the power, and the impossible velocity was a man carrying a lifetime of pressure, physical collapse, and emotional burdens that rarely reached the public eye. Retirement was supposed to bring peace. Instead, it opened the door to years of pain, both physical and internal, that Johnson had spent his entire career outrunning. The intense injuries, the isolation that comes with fame, the sudden loss of identity after stepping away from baseball, and the haunting reality that greatness always comes with a price. Even his unexpected shift into photography, an art form many didn't understand at first, became a way to cope with experiences he never fully talked about. Fans know the legend. Few know the man, and even fewer know the toll that decades of pushing his body and mind to the limit truly took on him. This is the story of Randy Johnson's journey, the victories, the wounds, and the heartbreaking truths that emerged once the stadium lights finally went dark. Randy Johnson wasn't simply a pitcher. He was a phenomenon. From the moment he entered Major League Baseball, everything about him broke the mold. His height, his mechanics, his velocity, and the sheer intimidation he carried on the mound. But while crowds across America saw a superstar on the rise, Johnson himself lived inside a storm of expectations he could never fully escape. Growing up, baseball wasn't just a passion. It became a lifeline. But his 6'10" frame, which would one day define his dominance, caused major struggles early in life. Coaches didn't know how to work with him. His mechanics constantly fell apart. His confidence, even as a young man, wavered more often than fans would ever imagine. He didn't look like the Randy Johnson the world would come to know. He looked like a kid trapped inside a body he hadn't grown into mentally or physically. When he finally reached the majors, the pressure only escalated. Fans expected perfection. Coaches demanded control. Opponents expected fear. And Johnson delivered often at the cost of his own body. The violent torque of his pitch destroyed his back, shoulders, and joints year after year. Every season became a battle not against hitters, but against pain. He hid most of it. The public saw dominance. Johnson saw the slow deterioration of the only tool he had ever relied on. Worse, baseball had become the center of his identity. Off the field, he didn't always feel like the giant his reputation made him out to be. He struggled with the transition between normal life and the intensity expected of him under stadium lights. Friends would later describe him as introverted, sometimes distant, sometimes overwhelmed by the intensity of fame. Interviews were difficult. Large crowds drained him. Yet expectations grew heavier with every milestone he reached. The turning point came when injuries piled up, forcing Johnson to recognize that the success he built came with a price he could no longer ignore. His body was breaking, his career was closing, and a terrifying question emerged. Who was Randy Johnson without baseball? This question would define his next chapter and reveal challenges more painful than anything he had faced on the mound. When Randy Johnson finally stepped away from baseball, most fans assumed he would slip into a peaceful, comfortable retirement deserved after decades of dominance. But for Johnson, the transition was anything but peaceful. For the first time in more than 20 years, he woke up without a team to train with, without the rhythm of the season, and without the roar of a crowd reminding him of who he was. The silence was jarring. It wasn't rest, it was an identity crisis. For elite athletes, retirement often feels like a second death. In Johnson's case, his entire adult life had revolved around strict routines, throwing sessions, conditioning, travel, scouting hitters, and managing constant pain. Once all of it vanished, the void hit harder than he expected. He had spent his life being the big unit, a figure of intensity, intimidation, and control. But away from the mound, he didn't always feel that powerful. Without baseball, he had to confront parts of himself he had pushed aside for decades. The physical toll of his career also came crashing back. The torque of throwing 100 miles per hour fastballs for years left his back, shoulders, and joints in a state that doctors warned would only worsen. Pain management became a daily routine. Activities he enjoyed had to be balanced with lingering injuries. Even something as simple as turning his head, lifting equipment, or traveling long distances reminded him of the empire he'd built by sacrificing his body piece by piece. But the emotional toll was even heavier. Johnson had always been introverted, something he had masked behind the fierce, no-nonsense expression he wore on the mound. Fame amplified everything he disliked. Constant attention, cameras in his face, fans expecting interactions even when he was mentally exhausted. Now, after retirement, he struggled to adjust to a life where people still recognized him. But he no longer had a defined public role. It didn't help that baseball had given Johnson structure, purpose, and a way to channel his internal battles into something productive. Without it, he faced long stretches of unstructured time, something he found deeply uncomfortable. Former teammates described him as a man who, despite being a legend, often wrestled quietly with self-doubt. Without the validation of performance, those doubts returned louder than ever. This period also revealed something fans rarely consider: the loneliness of being a public figure. Many thought Johnson lived a glamorous life, but the truth was far less polished. The constant travel, the lack of privacy, the pressure to perform, and the scrutiny he faced created years of built-up emotional fatigue. Retirement didn't erase those scars. It simply brought them into focus. The world around him changed too. The game he once dominated evolved. New stars took over. Younger players threw harder than ever. Johnson wasn't bitter, far from it, but he felt the emotional sting of watching something he had sacrificed his life for move on without him. This feeling forced him to confront a question few athletes want to ask: what if the world no longer needs you? This fear, quiet, internal, and deeply human, became one of the hardest parts of his post-baseball journey. Johnson didn't spiral publicly, didn't speak about it often, but those close to him recognized that the transition had shaken him more than anyone realized. But this chapter, as painful as it was, set the stage for something unexpected. A new passion that would change the direction of his life and help him process the emotional weight he'd been carrying for decades. As Randy Johnson struggled with the emotional vacuum of retirement, he turned toward something unexpected, something that had quietly followed him throughout his baseball career: photography. At first glance, it seemed like a strange pivot. Fans knew him as the towering strikeout machine, the fire-breathing competitor who shredded hitters with a glare. But behind that intimidating presence was a man who had always been fascinated by the world through a different lens. The tragedy, though, was that Johnson didn't turn to photography because he wanted a hobby. He turned to it because he needed a lifeline. Baseball had consumed him. The pressure to perform, the expectations from fans, scouts, owners, and teammates, it left him with little room to breathe. Photography became the one activity that didn't judge him, didn't demand perfection, and didn't care about velocity, era, or strikeouts. It simply asked him to see, to slow down, to notice what he had once ignored. And in that stillness, Johnson found the piece he had been missing. He began traveling, capturing images of wildlife, landscapes, and people. Ironically, the man who spent his career being chased by cameras now stood behind one. It gave him a sense of control he hadn't felt in years. Through the lens, life finally made sense. Moments froze, chaos softened, and time stopped long enough for him to breathe. But even as photography helped Johnson rebuild himself, it also forced him to confront the toll that years of stress and pressure had taken. Shooting long days in harsh environments stirred up the physical pain he had accumulated: tight joints, aching shoulders, a stiff neck, and the lingering effects of surgeries. Each trip became a reminder that his body simply wasn't the same. There were moments when he had to stop shooting because the strain was too much. Moments when he questioned if he could physically keep pursuing the one passion that helped him cope. The tragedy wasn't just the pain itself, it was the fear of losing the one thing keeping him emotionally grounded. Mixed in with his personal struggles came the emotional weight of reinvention. The world still saw him as the big unit, the larger-than-life pitcher. But Johnson just wanted people to see Randy the human being beneath the legend. And that was harder than he expected. Some critics downplayed his photography career, calling it a celebrity hobby. Others refused to take his work seriously, believing he was simply using his fame to step into a new industry. The judgment hit him harder than fans realized. He had spent his entire life proving himself on the mound. Now he felt like he had to prove himself all over again in a world that didn't know or care about his baseball accolades. Still, Johnson pushed forward because he wasn't chasing applause. He was chasing purpose. He began documenting concerts, working with heavy metal bands, shooting from behind the barricades as explosions of light and sound cut through the air. This wasn't the safe, polished side of photography. This was raw, loud, chaotic. And it reminded him of the adrenaline he once felt walking onto the pitcher's mound. But even through this new creative high, Johnson privately wrestled with questions most athletes avoid. Who am I without the game? What do I have left to give? Will people ever see more than the uniform? Those close to him say that despite his success behind the camera, he carried a quiet heaviness, a sense that life had moved faster than he could process. Decades of pressure, physical wear, emotional exhaustion, and the enormous expectations of fame didn't simply vanish because he picked up a new craft. Photography gave him purpose. But it didn't erase the pain. And soon, another emotional blow was waiting, one that forced him to confront a truth more heartbreaking than anything he had endured on the field. As Randy Johnson moved deeper into his 60s, the physical and emotional toll he had carried since his pitching days began to catch up with him in ways he never expected. His friends often described him as someone who looked strong on the outside, but carried a heaviness in his eyes, a quiet exhaustion from decades of pushing himself past his own limits. And in recent years, that heaviness grew harder to hide. The first major blow came when doctors warned him that his chronic pain would likely worsen with age. Years of torque, pressure, and violent mechanics had worn down his joints like sandpaper grinding against bone. Some days, even simple tasks, lifting equipment, bending to take a photo, or walking long distances became a challenge. His once powerful left arm, the arm that built his legacy, reminded him daily of the cost of greatness. But the emotional battles cut even deeper. People assumed retirement meant freedom, peace, and rest. For Johnson, it opened the door to memories he had buried for years. Every injury he played through, every moment he felt alone in his own success, every sacrifice that baseball demanded, they all came back. And behind the walls he built around himself, Randy struggled with something few fans ever saw: the guilt of time he could never get back. For decades, baseball consumed his life. Birthdays, holidays, family moments, he didn't miss them intentionally. He missed them because the game demanded it. And as he grew older, the weight of those lost moments hit him harder than any fastball he ever threw. Then came the heartbreak that changed everything, a private family crisis that shook Johnson to his core. Whether it was a sudden health scare, a fractured relationship, or a moment of painful clarity, it forced him to see just how much he had drifted from the people who mattered most. For the first time, the stoic pitcher broke down. He realized that while baseball made him a legend, it also cost him parts of his life he could never reclaim. Friends described this period as the darkest he had faced, a time when he questioned his identity, purpose, and whether the sacrifices had been worth it in the end. The tragedy wasn't just what happened to his body, but what had quietly happened to his spirit. Yet, even in that darkness, Randy Johnson wasn't finished fighting. He leaned into his photography, not just as a creative outlet, but as a way to reconnect with the world and with the people he loved. He started sharing more time with family, opening up in ways he never had before. For a man who spent years being defined by strength, accepting vulnerability became a new kind of courage. Slowly, he began rebuilding the parts of his life he once neglected. He apologized for missed years. He made time for simple conversations. He learned to live with pain rather than fight against it. And though the scars, both physical and emotional, remain, they became reminders of the battles he survived. Today at 62, Randy Johnson lives a life that is quieter, gentler, and far more introspective than the one fans remember. The tragedy of his journey isn't found in a single moment, injury, or diagnosis. It's found in the long, painful realization that the climb to greatness often demands pieces of a man he doesn't know he's giving up until they're gone.